Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Security in the 21st Century. My name is Suzanne Loftus, and I'm pleased to have with me on the show today, Dr. Daniel Hamilton. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dan. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
So Dr. Hamilton is currently a professor at Johns Hopkins University. Prior to that, he was the director of the Global Europe program at the Wilson Center. He's a widely recognized expert on U.S. foreign policy and on European, Eurasian, and transatlantic security, as well as economic and political affairs. He's held a variety of senior positions in the U.S. Department of State, including Deputy Assistant Secretary for European Affairs, responsible for NATO, OSCE, and transatlantic security issues. So today's podcast will be specifically on some of these issues, such as NATO and the OSCE. So we're lucky to have Dr. Hamilton with us today to discuss these issues in more detail. So you've written a number of articles on NATO and the OSCE in 2021. And you make it a point to say that it is well time for NATO to revise its strategic concept. So basing the realities of 2021 in comparison with the current strategic concept, which was made in 2010, why is it now well time, as you say, for NATO to revise a strategic concept? If you could elaborate for our audience.
Thank you. Well, again, thank you for having me join you today. The strategic concept is sort of NATO's guiding document. It provides a general frame for what the alliance should prioritize. And there have been a number of those through the 70 years of NATO. Probably every 10 years or so, it seems to be time to look at it again. And that's the case again today. So 2010, if we think about it, was really a long time ago. NATO, that document talked about the chances of conflict in Europe being low, NATO at peace, and it was before Russian intervention in Ukraine. It was before a lot of the disruptive challenges that we're facing today have afflicted not only Europe, but the United States, the rise of great power competition. So it's really time to look at that again. And I would argue that the 2010 document was sort of emblematic of, you could have called an age of stability, the post-Cold War, sort of 25 years after the Cold War. And Europe was, free of that conflict. It was trying to rebuild, come together. There was terrorism, clearly, but it was not seen as, this existential threat like the Cold War posed to much of Europe. I would argue today we've kind of moved into a different type of era, which I would characterize as an age of disruption, that we're trying to preserve what stability we have in our democracies, but everything that we can think about that connects us to other societies is now susceptible to disruption, either by thinking actors, state government, states, non-state actors, even Mother Nature. If you think of climate change, you think of pandemics. These are all security challenges in many ways, or have security implications. NATO's not recognized much of that in the past. And if we think about great power competition, the rise of destructive capabilities in the hands of groups or even individuals, the alliance has to think harder about how it needs to reposition itself for an age of disruption versus this age of stability that characterized the document, in 2010.
Well, thank you for elaborating. It's this term, age of disruption, is very helpful and very clear for us to understand what's going on in the world today as opposed to before. And one other element that would go well into this conversation is the element of democracy. So back during the Cold War, geopolitical realities often led NATO to overlook questionable democratic credentials of some of its member states. And this is a point that you argue in some of your work, where you say that the alliance can no longer afford to look the other way today. So what is it that makes the nature of threats today different, that we cannot overlook this? For example, why can we not overlook Turkey's democratic backsliding? Is it not strategic to have an ally in the Black Sea region, no matter what their inclinations are politically?
I think you're correct. During the Cold War, we did overlook some of those, and I think we can argue the merits of that at the time. But today, if you think about the debates about competition among states of great power, the way those states are governed becomes a strategic issue. We're talking about, democracy versus authoritarian ways of managing societies. And that's become quite critical. So internal governance really matters. If NATO is an alliance of sort of realist alliance of states that really have nothing in common except some common interests, I don't believe it will endure, nor would it have endured until now. Fundamentally, NATO is an alliance of democracies. That's its strength. The Russia or China don't have any of those kinds of partners. That's their weakness. So we should build on our strengths, but we should understand that democracy today is also under challenge, not only from without, from external sources, but even from within. And we should have the courage to say that. So, if you think about democracies that are weak, that are not robust, they can be susceptible to subversion, to corruption, to information warfare, to blackmail. A malign influence within such weak democratic states could mean that non-NATO countries could influence internal NATO decision-making. So this is just not a nice thing to have. It actually has a security implication. And that's why I have argued that if we reconsider the strategic concept, affirmation of NATO as an alliance of democracies is foundational now. It's not just something just to say in a throwaway statement. We need to recommit to NATO as an effective defensive alliance of democracies bound by common values. That's in the North Atlantic Treaty. That's written not only in the preamble about our commitment to uphold, safeguard freedom found on principles of democracy, individual liberty, rule of law, and promote free institutions. It's throughout the entire treaty, to which all NATO nations have subscribed to. So to implement our own commitments, we should be doing this. And today it has the strategic importance that I would argue makes it just, so, as I say, so foundational to anything else the alliance will want to do.
Well, that's an excellent point. But to be able to strengthen our democracies, it's vital for us to understand why we're experiencing this democratic backsliding, both, as you said, from within and from without. And would you be able to just highlight one of them or some of the main points as to why we're experiencing this democratic backsliding?
Well, I think it does go back to, again, the point I made about the age of disruption. We're in a new type of period. Think about the crises we've had to endure since the strategic concept was written. We've had financial recessions, we've had all the problems of inequality that have been exacerbated, particularly in the United States, but I think in a number of European countries, polarization of societies. We've had to deal with this pandemic. We've had to deal with conflict in Europe. There's war going on in Europe. We have a lot of things we've having grapple with, in which some new technologies, some new tools have emerged that are helping us. Technology has helped us try to beat the COVID pandemic through vaccines, but it also creates more negative influences through disinformation, misinformation, hybrid warfare, lots of things that, as I say, can disrupt the ability of societies to function. That is sort of the critical security challenge I think we have to tackle. And NATO traditionally has not really ventured into that space. So I think that is what we now need to do. It's not a job for NATO only. In fact, in some areas, NATO probably wouldn't take the lead. It's more where NATO fits into how democratic societies need to grapple with these disruptive challenges. Think about the supply chains that are going on now. Everything's bottled up, it's not a military challenge in that sense, but it is impairing our ability to function. So that might be more a job for the United States than the EU to work on. NATO might focus on the defense-related aspects of that.
Mhm.
So I'm not arguing for a NATO-only approach here. The Western alliance, if you will, comprises a whole set of institutions and connections, and we should use all of them to deal with these new kinds of challenges.
Yes, definitely. It's definitely a job for the European Union, the United States, the transatlantic community, governments, whole of society, and NATO to work together on strengthening our societies from within. But in terms of the way NATO should update its core tasks, so collective defense, crisis management, and cooperative security, in what ways do you envision that NATO should update these priorities?
Yeah, I mean, the 2010 strategic concept identified three core tasks for the alliance: deterrence and defense, crisis management, and cooperative security. That sort of has been framing the alliance's efforts for the last decade or more. I think each of those actually hold up pretty well as important tasks for the alliance. But I think this age of disruption that I have been mentioning not only requires us to evolve each of those tasks, modernize them, update them, but to add a new fourth core task of resilience or comprehensive resilience, which I can come back to in a second. And so there are four now core tasks, it seems to me, plus this foundational element I mentioned of democratic resilience, of affirming our alliance is democratic alliance. That is foundational. So my approach, to sum it up quickly, is 1 + 4.
Mhm.
The 1 is the foundational affirmation of NATO as an alliance of democracies. That's the premise. That's the foundation. The 4 are the three core tasks that exist plus resilience. So deterrence and defense remain a critical core task of NATO. It is central. We not only need to affirm that, we need to understand how deterrence and defense need to evolve to meet the kinds of security challenges we're facing today. Not only traditional conflict, as I said, Russia has invaded neighboring countries, and many NATO allies are concerned about their own security because of those activities. But we have to think about energy intimidation, cyber challenges, unconventional kinds of conflicts, and how do you deter and defend there? There's a whole new world opening up of emerging and disruptive technologies. How does deterrence and defense have to evolve to address that rapid pace of innovation? The second is crisis management. That's been an important task for the alliance, and we should continue it. I think here we might be able to square the circle with European efforts of what they call strategic autonomy, with American concerns that the Europeans are trying to create parallel structures next to NATO to the EU. My pitch would be let's allow Europe, we want Europe to be more capable, because that helps everybody. And Europe is not capable in a whole variety of areas, such as lift, logistics, communications, things that the United States has to do for the European allies that they can't do for themselves. Nobody has an interest in continuing that. So let's work with our European allies and the EU and others to allow Europe to be what I call the first responder to crises in and around its neighborhood. I think that would be a way of defining what this debate is about strategic autonomy, give it some meaning, because right now it's a buzzword that doesn't have much content, in my view. If Europe could be the first responder to crises in and around its neighborhood, it doesn't mean NATO isn't there, but NATO doesn't have to react every minute. It also potentially free up the United States to deal with lots of other challenges elsewhere in the world that it has to work on now. And it's in Europe's interest, frankly, for the US to do that. And the third is cooperative security, third core task, with other partners of NATO. There are more partners of NATO than there are members. NATO has a huge vast network of partners, and that's an important, again, advantage when it comes to thinking about how we deal with strategic competition with autocratic states. But we need to evolve those partnerships. I think it's very hard to know how to take the partnership with Ukraine and Georgia further. They clearly want to join NATO. There's no consensus for them to do that. We have to think about that harder. We have to think about how cooperative security might affect our security interests in the global commons now. Freedom of information, freedom of navigation. What about outer space, the Arctic? All of these sort of common issues, even climate change now, there are huge security implications, and NATO can work with partners on a variety of those, including the European Union, but many others as well. But I come to my new point, which is about resilience. You know, if you think about everything that affects the ability of societies, free societies to function, we are all more susceptible to disruption these days than in the past, because we're so intertwined and interconnected. That's given us, you know, untold wealth and prosperity, peace in many ways, but it can be used now, weaponized even, to disrupt our societies. So we have to think hard about how to become more resilient to those disruptive challenges. NATO's done some work there, but it tends to be country by country, basically telling each ally, you know, you show that you're resilient. Think about Europe today. Europe's so intertwined, it doesn't really matter how resilient you know, one European country is if its neighbor isn't. So we have to think more about shared resilience. That's not been what NATO has been doing so far. And frankly, if we think about where this disruption is coming from, Ukraine, for instance, is being used as a laboratory for all sorts of disruptive problems by Russian actors, for instance, and that ripples back into the NATO space. So we clearly have an interest, it would seem to me, to also think hard about what I call forward resilience, projecting resilience forward to partners, to other countries that are fragile, and their fragility affects our security. So resilience, it seems to me, is a dynamic concept. It's being approached so far by the alliance as a static concept. I think we need to change the mindset. We need to lift it as a core task. And we need to think of how NATO needs to work then with the EU and other kinds of institutions that have, you know, more competence in the civilian area, because much of these infrastructures are civilian or they're owned by the private sector. We have to think about how we engage the private sector in these types of discussions as well. That's a big agenda. It's very different than 2010.
Yes, indeed. And instead of viewing European rhetoric on strategic autonomy as a threat, as you mentioned so clearly and elaborately, we should see it instead as an opportunity for EU-NATO collaboration in areas that are more, you know, that engage more civil society and civil issues, such as, you know, resilience and democracy. So we can build better defenses for what you called the strategic competition that we're also facing today. But one other note on this strategic competition: although we can try and achieve you know, these improvements within our communities and societies, does it matter a lot that we view China differently? The European Union does not necessarily view China the same way as the United States. Does that pose a serious challenge for our resilience?
I think we're having a good conversation across the Atlantic these days about China. I think there was a reluctance in some, but not all European countries, to sort of take on the notion that China had become this really strategic challenge. But the EU itself defined, if you want to use the EU frame, you know, China as a partner in some areas, as a competitor in some areas, and as a, they call it a systemic rival in some areas. They did that a few years ago. The Biden administration has basically taken that similar language. They don't use the term systemic rival. They say adversary, strategic adversary, but basically they're talking a similar thing. But they do also talk about having to work with China in some areas like climate change, non-proliferation, maybe dealing with, you know, countries like Iran or North Korea. We need to work with China in areas like that. But the Europeans and Americans, I think, largely agree that China is also a competitor in many areas, particularly in the economic, technological space, where it is using industrial subsidies. It's not living up to its WTO commitments. It's doing lots of things that I don't think there's a huge debate across the Atlantic on. The debate is how do we address it? And that's clearly a challenge. And then the third area, systemic rival. I think the EU has used that term, but hasn't had a deep debate about it. Whereas the United States, we've had we're having an ongoing debate about what it means that China is a strategic adversary in some areas. So we need to come around on that. So I don't think there's really a European view. I think we're having a transatlantic discussion. And that is changing in many ways. If you look at the NATO communique from June 2021, China was mentioned many, many times, and it had never been mentioned much in any NATO communiques in the past. So, and that's a consensus document. So NATO is stepping up on this. The strategic concept clearly will have to take on the issue of China. It's not about NATO really, in my mind, going to Asia or the Indo-Pacific. It's that China is coming to Europe. Often our European colleagues are worried about what they call the pivot to Asia by the Americans. They should maybe be equally concerned about China's pivot to Europe, or Asia's pivot even back to Europe, bringing some of Asia's challenges to the European continent. But also China is very active power in Europe these days through investments in defense-related supply chains or certain companies that are critical, technology providers, certain strategic ports that give it access to lots of different types of, flows and networks. Its challenges to the global commons. Much of Europe's commerce and trade depends on a whole series of straits, and maritime straits that connect Europe, Eurasia to the Indo-Pacific. Some of those are being challenged by China today. That is a direct security concern for Europe. It's not about the Americans sort of dreaming this up. If you think about the information space and what China is doing in that space to control societies, this is challenge, and exports those technologies to other countries. Think about China's role in space. China as a non-Arctic power, arguing that it should be an Arctic power. We have some challenges we have to face together. And finally, frankly, China and Russia are working more closely together in a whole range of areas. It's not really an alliance, but that type of closeness could, on the margin, affect the calculus of risk that either China or Russia would be willing to encounter, more risky behaviors than maybe if each were working on their own. And that, again, could have some security implications, not only for NATO Europe, but also for the US and allies in the Indo-Pacific. So these connections are really kind of global these days. I don't think it's thinking about Pacific or Europe in very different ways. There are many connections we have to think harder about, and a strategic concept review would allow us to do that.
Yes, definitely. It's not so black and white. The issues, as you said, are a little bit more complicated than that and do require a serious revision today. But shifting the conversation a little bit more now towards the OSCE. So we hear a lot about NATO, transatlantic security, China, Russia, strategic competition, but we still have this very important organization, the OSCE, that we quite frankly don't hear as much about, but it is still nonetheless very important. So in your view, why is the OSCE important for the European security architecture today?
Well, the OSCE is an organization that often we might forget a little bit about, but it is, I think, still quite important. It has important potential, and it's played an important role in the past. If we think about the end of the Cold War, the OSCE, the CSCE at the time, was very important in anchoring the sort of baskets of security, economic cooperation, and values that have really, guided the peaceful end of the Cold War and ushered in at this new era. But I think we should have the courage, the honesty to say, as time marched on, that vision of what Mikhail Gorbachev called a common European home and US President Bush called a Europe whole and free, that vision became more of a slogan than a project. Our achievements failed our aspirations. Revisionists have grown their influence. Borders have been changed by force. Democratic governments have been toppled or weakened from within. Independent media have been suppressed. Shooting wars have erupted in the OSCE space. Foreign troops are in countries without invitation. The danger of military accidents or incidents, miscalculations have risen because the confidence building measures the OSCE had created have all sort of deteriorated. The racial, religious, ethnic hatred is alive and well throughout the OSCE space, and that's an important area the OSCE has devoted attention to. So I'm concerned that, the Europe of our hopes that were reflected in the greatest documents of the Helsinki Final Act and the Paris Charter becomes the Europe of our fears, less whole and free, more fractured, more anxious. And that's not the Europe any of us, I hope, would want, but we should have the temerity to understand that's the kind of Europe we might be facing. So the OSCE has one interesting advantage over institutions like NATO or the EU. Those institutions are basically groups of like-minded countries. We have our disagreements, but essentially we are agreeing to be in the alliance together, and the EU is deeply bound by a whole series of institutional arrangements. The OSCE is the one institution where those who disagree come together. And that's its premise, that if you come together with your disagreements and try to work out rules of the road and new ways of working, that's not a bad thing to do. It's worth your time. It is often blocked by lots of arguments. It takes a long time to get things done there, but it has shown its value. If you think about what the OSCE does in the field, for instance, it has had a major impact in helping mitigate conflicts between countries or within societies, which is a really important part of security, is security within societies, between governments and their societies, not just between governments themselves. The OSCE's played a big role there. It's playing an important role right now in Ukraine, in the conflicts there. It is, set up a whole series of things that need to be done in Belarus as the opposition faces Mr. Lukashenko there. It has played an amazing role in the Balkans over time since the wars in the 1990s. So it does real stuff. It's not just a talk shop, but it has its challenges. And Russia, I think, believes now today the organization has been captured, it would probably say, by the West. The West says Moscow is not living up to many of its agreements. And the countries in between, I know they hate to be called that, but the countries that sort of in between the institutional West and Russia feel caught between these different basic approaches to the organization. So it has its challenges. There are no easy fixes, but I still believe it's an important part of the European security architecture, if you will.
Yeah, definitely. And let's just elaborate a little bit more on these challenges and also your advice for improving the OSCE framework and courses of action from here on.
Well, as I say, it's under challenge. The Swedes this year are the chair in office. Poland is the chair next year. So, things keep moving on. But it occupies a different space. It's not about doing the same things NATO or the EU are doing. It's doing something else. I believe, maintaining the OSCE's field operations is quite important. They are simply an important instrument of conflict prevention and mitigation. If you think about Transnistria, Nagorno-Karabakh, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Eastern Ukraine, Crimea, the OSCE is not active everywhere, but it could be more active in many of those areas. And as I say, in Ukraine, I think it's still quite important to maintain its role. In fact, it should enhance its role if it could in Ukraine. The conventional arms control framework that was basically one of the OSCE's signature contributions has sort of eroded. The Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty is in limbo. The Vienna document, which is an important document that codified military significant and verifiable confidence and security building measures like information exchange, on-site inspections of certain kinds of military activities and so on. That's not like the NATO strategic concept. That's not been revised since 2011, but that provides an important aspect of security that we should work on. The Open Skies Treaty, which was an important element of this, is basically now in question because both the United States and Russia don't want to be part of it anymore. So that has reduced transparency and probably not to our overall advantage. So I think we need to think about how to bolster the things that OSCE has done in the past well and try to think of new ways to do that. But I come back to my theme from the earlier part of the discussion that we need to think about defining principles for new kinds of security challenges. This is where the OSCE has a role to play. As I say, it's a place where the states of uncommon cause come together, whereas NATO and the EU are where states of common cause come together. So if states of uncommon cause can actually work out rules of the road to deal with the disruptive challenges that our societies face, that is a new area of security where there are no rules, there is no road. And it's similar to what happened in this 1970s with the Helsinki Final Act, that East and West came together, didn't agree on much, but worked out some principles and rules of the road that allowed them to manage their differences. I think we could do something like that again. We have to, the past was about protecting territories. Now it's about protecting our connectedness, how our societies are connected, because that can bring great peace and progress. It can also ripple back through dependencies and undermines security. That's kind of a new kind of area to build resilience and build the rules of the road among states that disagree on lots of things. I think that's what the OSCE does well that other organizations of simply those who agree, like NATO, EU, they're not comprehensive in their membership, probably would do less well.
Exactly. That's a fundamental strength of the OSCE. Sometimes we just keep reproducing our own thoughts and thinking that this is going to be a way to secure our futures, but we don't quite collaborate enough with those who don't agree with us. So a framework like the OSCE is very vital in this time of disruption, as you say. So Dr. Hamilton, I really appreciate your time today. You've definitely explained some very complex things in a very short amount of time, and we appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Okay, and to our audience, thanks again for tuning back in to Security in the 21st Century.